What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another live stream. Keen to go through some more student responses. There's been a lot of submissions. Some have been quite bulky, some quite large. So just going to be going through the more concise ones. Please only submit one paragraph at a time to a given question if you want feedback, and don't jam an entire essay into a single paragraph, as that will not get around it. We need to try and divvy up the attention and the feedback so we can get to as many as possible. So just focusing today on a couple of responses that have come through. These ones seem to be more HSE Year 12 focused, but we're going to be unpacking them on a broader level so that anyone watching this will be able to take something away from it and apply those essay writing skills to their own work. So we'll get into that shortly. Just going to let people trickle in as they may. They may not, though, because recording this when it is at least nearing holidays for most people. Victoria already on holidays, New South Wales in the last week before the Easter break. So happy Easter to everyone as well. But let's see who is keen on jumping in anyway. The Easter break is only a couple of weeks. It's not like the extended winter break that a lot of students get. So it is a good time to kind of get ahead, but it's not going to give you a ton of time. It's good to just focus on one or two things. One thing maybe that you're catching up on, maybe you're going back over the common module, maybe you're doing short answer practice, maybe you are tidying up your craft of writing. But I would pick one thing to kind of catch up on from a past unit, and then I would really focus on the next unit that you are doing in class or that you're going to be assessed on next. So for instance, if you're doing module A textual conversations and you need to eventually construct an essay, perhaps in class or online in term 2, say around May or June, then I would be focusing on getting ahead with that while again kind of catching up on something else so that you don't have this huge backlog of things to do before trials or before the final exams. So catch up on one thing over this break from a past unit, implement the feedback you got from a previous assessment, do more practice on something that you feel is a weakness. And then the second thing is get ahead with the next unit that you're looking at, or maybe you already have an assessment coming up for that. Get ahead this holidays on that, because time is going to go quicker and quicker every term until the final exams are here. And you want to have as much stuff ready to go and prepared as you can, especially in terms of crafting base essays and base responses and doing the practice early on so that you can then really hone in on perfecting those drafts as you get closer to the exams and practicing new questions and responding to unseen questions. That's what you want to be really good at. That's what you want to be focusing on as you get closer to the exams. So make sure you get on top of your drafts, catching up on one unit that you feel was a weakness in the last 2 terms. And yeah, focus on the big assessment that is ahead for you. So a few of you in here. Great to see you guys. Yes. Ali, Julian, great to see you guys. Ali, first question in. How does essay memorization work? Like, what part of the essays can you memorize word for word? Well, look, first of all, you don't need to memorize anything word for word. If I'm being honest with you, not everyone should do word for word memorization because not everyone can do it that way. Like some people just don't have that ability, or they don't have, I think everyone kind of has the ability, but in a small time frame, not everyone should spend that much time on it because they might not be able to actually hold that much information in a short time frame, and they'd be better off doing it a different way. So know thyself comes to mind, right? Know if you are someone who can memorize something in a relatively short period of time. If you can, that's an advantage, and you can look to do a word for word approach. If you're someone who really struggles to memorize something in that way, where you're learning everything perfectly, because that's a grueling process, but it can obviously pay off because you've got this amazing base essay that you know off by heart, and then you can just focus on adapting to the question on the day, and you've got all the material to draw from, and it's already polished and sophisticated, and you can just spend your time adapting it or using the most relevant parts. that's great. But if you're not that person, and that's fine, doesn't mean you're going to get a worse mark. You just need to plan ahead. You need to probably prepare earlier. And instead of memorizing something word for word, you actually can look to just familiarize yourself with what each sentence was about. And I find that knowing a trigger word, knowing one key word from each sentence in your draft to trigger your memory about what you were writing about can be really effective. So then you only have to memorize the trigger words in order, so you know what each sentence was focused on. And often that brings everything else back. And then you can do practice essays just thinking about that word. And it doesn't matter if you don't repeat the exact essay word for word, as long as you got the gist of that sentence down. So a trigger word is a really good way to kind of prompt your memory of what the sentence was about. But to answer your question, if you are trying to memorize something word for word, I just first of all wanted to deal with whether you have to do that. You don't, but it is an advantage if you can do it, because as long as you do it early, because it will actually allow you to focus all of your attention on the day, not on remembering the things you want to talk about, but on answering the question. But if you're someone who memorizes and just regurgitates and you just rewrite it and you don't answer the question, you're going to be capped at how well you can do. Maybe you can get like a 15 out of 20, probably max 16. But these days, markers heavily penalize responses that are pre-prepared in the sense that they don't respond to the question that's actually been asked. So it could make a world of difference to memorize something and regurgitate it, or memorize something and then just focus all of your attention on answering the question. How do you actually go about memorization? I would learn an essay like a speech. So instead of writing out the words every time, because writing out something takes a lot of time, it might take 40 minutes to write it out. Hopefully not, right? Because you need to time your essay so that if it was a 40-minute assessment, you could do it in about 32 minutes, ideally, right? 32 to 34, depending on your speed. But let's say it's 32 minutes. You, instead of writing out the full essay for 32 minutes and then trying to remember as much as possible, what I would do is I would print out a copy and look at the first sentence, say it back to myself until I'm comfortable enough saying it without looking, and then I would look away and try and repeat the sentence without looking. If I can say the full sentence perfectly, then I move on to the next sentence. If I don't, I look back at where I got stuck or where I got it wrong, and then I focus on that error to make sure it doesn't happen again, and then I do it again. And you keep doing that until you get the sentence correct. Then you move on to the next sentence. Then you recite both of them together, and you keep adding sentences onto each other. When you can say a full paragraph out loud without looking perfectly, then write it down. Then you write it down without looking, and that cements it in. I've got a YouTube video on how to memorize. Just search Jeddle, how to memorize an essay, if you want to learn about doing it that way. But again, you don't have to do it that way. And if you do it that way, you're not doing it so that you can just regurgitate it on the day word for word. Because if you get a different question, which you almost certainly will, you'll get a different question to the practice one that you built that essay to. And you should always have a practice question rather than just a generic essay that doesn't have any direction. When you get a new question, you need to make sure you've got time to spare to think about that new question, which is why you only memorize an essay after you've timed it and cut it down. Never memorize an essay that's too long. That's the first rule. People get obsessed with memorizing, they don't even time it, and then they don't have any time on the day to actually adapt. Then you do just repeat it and you haven't answered the question, and you can only get, again, like maybe a 15. You can only get a low to mid B, even if you had a perfect essay to a different question. If you haven't engaged with the words of the question. And some teachers would disagree with me on that. They'll say, oh, you can only get a 10 out of 20. But I've seen some really good essays that people have just repeated and they've got like a 14 or 15, but they could have been a 20 if they just drew upon that material and actually focused a lot of their preparation on doing multiple practice questions and writing out new introductions and new topic sentences, drawing on the base material that they've learnt well, but learning how to genuinely respond in a specific and meaningful way to new key terms in new questions. That's what will give you the extra 5 to 8 marks. So memorization process, just look up the step-by-step video, type in Jeddle, how to memorize an essay on YouTube. That's the how-to. And then remember the caveats. Remember all the points that I just raised then about when you should memorize, who should memorize. Not everyone should memorize word for word. If you have the ability to memorize something within a couple of days, amazing. That is an advantage for you. If you don't, if you can't do it, don't stress and force yourself to do it, because if you don't feel like you can memorize that way, what will happen is you'll get into the exam, and as soon as you kind of doubt yourself or you think you've lost your spot, you'll just forget everything because you haven't learned it well and you don't learn that way, okay? Which is fine. You need to, again, think about other ways. Maybe you need to have mind maps. Maybe you need to just focus on one word per sentence and focus on what that sentence was about, and you can write it differently every time, but just do a lot of practice. So there's lots of ways to effectively memorize something without doing it this word for word way. The word for word way is just like the most kind of rigid technical way of doing it. I used to do it a lot, but again, to be honest, not saying it to brag, I have pretty good memory. Not the best memory, I have pretty good memory. So I was able to memorize something within about 3 hours, right? An essay, but 3 hours of focus time, and I would forget it if I didn't recap on it. But I use that to my advantage. But I spent so much time perfecting the essay, cutting it down, timing it, and then I spent so much time after looking at different essay questions and thinking, how would I effectively write a new essay using a lot of that material, because I'm going to be so much faster because I've got like a base. I'm using like 80% of it, but I'm remolding it, I'm reshaping the argument, writing a slightly different thesis, obviously, each time. But yeah, you need to kind of go about that process very deliberately, and you need to give yourself plenty of time in advance. All right, I've finished my textual conversations essay. My school did it this term, and I have Mod C next term. Amazing. So yes, you want to wait on getting the results back, obviously, but if you haven't got them back, you don't want to just wait and do nothing. So don't wait and do nothing. But if you have got them back, you need to implement that feedback. Why didn't you get full marks? Do everything you can to lift the quality to a full mark essay. Maybe it was because you didn't respond to the question well enough. Maybe it was because the sophistication wasn't there in the actual material. So you need to address all of those things. But in your case, you're trying to perfect the module A so it's ready to go for trials, because that's the next time you're going to use that. But you're also looking ahead to module C and starting to get your drafts there. Read the prescribed text that you're going to be looking at for module C. Start drafting now, even if you feel unprepared and you're not ready to go. And I don't know what module C is. Do some research, watch some Jeddle videos, watch online, look at the resources on jeddle.com. It's easy enough to get your head around what module C is. Start preparing a core draft straight away, an imaginative, a discursive, or a persuasive. Start with one, focus on one, get one right, and then you can work on how you would adapt into the other forms, okay? So create that one draft module C composition based on at least one of the prescribed texts that you're looking at. Try and sound like the person you studied effectively. Write a reflection. Again, watch the content on Jeddle up front to know what you ultimately need to build towards. And get started early. The earlier you start on every module, the better mark you're going to get on average, right? It's all about starting early so you have plenty of time to edit and update. It's that editing process that everyone underestimates. You need enough time to edit. You need weeks to edit. So start with a really basic draft and build from there. Julian, thank you for all the content. No worries. Thank you so much for watching the content, consuming it, following. Hugely helpful. Any big tips on how to prepare for Artists of the Floating World? Artists of the Floating World, I love that text actually, and awesome if you've watched some of the YouTube videos. Put out a few videos a while back on artists, so hopefully they've been helpful. And there's obviously content on jeddle.com if you're subscribed there. In terms of how to prepare for those essays, I think just getting a really good understanding of the context and the form for that particular text, because a lot of people get confused on, following the story because it's nonlinear and there's so many flashbacks and there's so many doubts that are being projected, so much denial, self-deception, that if you can get your head around how it's been written from a narrative perspective and also looking at the contextual influences, how the setting of Artist of the Floating World, post-war Japan, going back to during World War II and the influence that Ono had, and then relating that to the context in which it was written, 1980s, Thatcher, all of the changes that were happening politically there. If you can match up the setting and the context in which it was written, and you can really understand how the narration style was used to relate to those concepts and the tensions that were being explored, you're going to develop a really great foundational understanding for any essay, because those things need to come out in any essay on any topic. You always need to be drilling into the context, and then talking about how the form and the way it was written is projecting these concerns that do relate to the context. So I would be getting my head around that. And then, of course, just starting with a basic essay structure, have a look at the videos, start building a structure around the progression of the novel and the ideas. It's very much about, the idea of truth. What is truth? That postmodern element of, is there any one objective truth? Because we see so many different perspectives. We're forced to question so many different versions of history and what happened. That's something you can look at, right? How much certainty can we have? What about our own memory, the fallibility of memory, the fact that everyone can remember things differently, especially to appease or satisfy our own agenda. Like, if I want to be right about something, I'm going to remember something that happened in a particular way that favors my position. So people remember things in a way that's convenient to them, which means we don't know that that's actually how it happened. So there's a lot of this exploration of truth for artists of the floating world. And I think if you can really dial into this idea of truth, self-deception, convincing ourselves of lies, not knowing what is true, the fact that there are always different perspectives politically, ideologically, if you can really create an essay structure, 3 body paragraphs around those ideas and the progression of the novel in that way and how we're taking on that journey as the reader, linking everything to context and form, then if you can do all of that, and that's quite a lot there, if you can do all of that, starting with just a base essay structure and coming up with 3 great topic sentences about 3 ideas that you think work really well together, 3 ideas that kind of progress and they encapsulate your understanding of the whole novel. Start with those 3 ideas, because then that gives you the body paragraph structure and you can build everything else on top, including the introduction after that. That's how I would approach it. But glad to hear that you're doing Artists of the Floating World. Again, one of my favorite texts that is on the current HSC list. Fantastic one. It's a great one that has enough depth that you can really differentiate yourself from others if you do the extra work in understanding the context and how it is written in terms of the form and the narrative perspective, the narration style, and how that relates to some of those ideas, those postmodern ideas around truth and perspective. Okay? Hope that helps. Does a mod A essay need to have 3 body paragraphs? My school does it with 2 body paragraphs. Yeah, no, some people do it with 2 paragraphs because it's very hard to write 4 body paragraphs or even 3 in the time that is allocated. So what a lot of schools would advise you to do, or some schools, probably not most, but some, they'll get you to do 2 bodies. And the 2 bodies is basically like a squished 4-body essay, because you're doing the comparison between the 2 texts in each of those bodies, I assume. It's very rare that a school would tell you to do 1 body paragraph on one text and 1 on another, and that's it. Usually that would be a combined approach, I'm imagining, but let me know, yes, if that's the case. So usually, yeah, you'd be doing the comparisons within 2 bodies, and you just have 2 ideas, 2 key ideas that you're exploring, and then you explore how each of those ideas are represented in each text with the comparisons made clear. So that's not uncommon. You can still get full marks doing 2 large paragraphs. It's more efficient because you only have to do 2 topic sentences and 2 links. But the typical structure that I go towards is either a 4-body or, more commonly, if I'm being realistic about time, 3-body. And I would look at the first text, the second text, and then you can compare them in the 3rd body paragraph if you aren't able to do 2 more paragraphs where you separate them. But whether you're doing a 2-body paragraph essay or a 4-body paragraph essay, in both cases, for a Module A textual conversations essay, you are basically looking at 2 key ideas, but then you're splitting the 2 key ideas between the 2 texts. And that's what creates either the 4 bodies or the 2, if you do the comparison within a single paragraph for each of those ideas. So 2 and 4 are basically the same. You're just cutting it down so you save a bit of time. It's more realistic. Very hard to do a complete 4-body paragraph Module A essay in the 40 minutes while also adapting to the question. So I don't mind the 2-body option. 3-body is probably the most advanced way of doing it if you can do an integrated 3-body paragraph structure. So if you're doing 2 texts for Module A, which you will be if you're doing advanced, you do a comparison of the texts within 3 body paragraphs. So they're all integrated. You're never just talking about one text in one paragraph. They're all integrated. I would only do that if you feel like you're at that advanced level and you have a really good grasp of the connections. Otherwise, there's no need to do that. You can do the first body on the first text, the second body on the second text, but in the second body with the second text, you should be making links back to the first one. And then in the third body, you're basically doing the same thing that you just did in body 1 and 2, but squishing it together into a comparative paragraph, because that is going to be more realistic for the time that you're given. Otherwise, you would split them up as well. Hopefully that makes sense. There's basically 3 different options I just gave you there with the 2 bodies, the 4 bodies, the 3 bodies. There's 2 different ways of doing the 3 bodies. So it's all about timing and making sure that whatever you do, you are getting those comparisons in, but you don't always need to have comparisons within the one paragraph. Like if it's your very first body paragraph, you can just look at the first text and then start making links in the second body when you look at the next text. All right, Rahan, good to see you again. Wanted to know if it's always necessary to put a thesis statement before you state the author and book. It's not always necessary. I think having a kind of opening conceptual statement is a bit of a bonus. It doesn't mean you can't get full marks if that's what you're asking, if you were to bring in the text straight away. Sometimes I like bringing in the text straight away, even in the first sentence, and then bringing in the idea in that sentence as well, because it prevents you from having this kind of warm-up sentence above. If you can nail the conceptual sentence above it, like a thesis where you're introducing the core problem or core value of a textual conversation, or just the core idea that you're going to be unpacking in the essay, then that's great. If you can do that in relation to the question, fantastic. Have a thesis statement at the top. If you want to call it that, it's really just you introducing the problem that you're going to be unpacking. Some people call that a thesis, some don't. But you can bring that in at the top, then you can bring in the text. And then at the end of the introduction, a lot of people call that the thesis. The thesis at the end of the introduction is, okay, I've told you what the problem is that I'm going to be exploring. Here's how the texts explore that problem and work through it. And my last sentence is, what am I going to prove about this? What's the ultimate takeaway that I'm going to be proving to you? So you kind of, the first sentence is almost introducing the problem, whereas the last sentence of your introduction is often more of a thesis, in that you say, ultimately, boom, this is what I'm going to prove. This is what the texts do. This is the value of it, because you've now introduced the problem and introduced the text. So I like to think of the last sentence as more of a thesis, whereas the first sentence is more of introducing the problem, hopefully in a very concise and crafty way. That's where you can hook the marker straight away. A nice, concise, punchy sentence if you can. Or it could just be, it could be a little bit longer and a bit more sophisticated. But yes, try and have that sentence at the top that doesn't mention the text. But if you feel like you're not adding much value and you just tend to repeat the question, jump straight into introducing the text along with the key ideas that relate to the question. So it kind of depends where you're coming from. For someone who feels like they often repeat the question, I would avoid that first sentence, because you're going to put the marker off straight away by just repeating what the question had. So kind of know where you're at, practice both ways, and see if you're actually able to execute that top thesis statement or first sentence that doesn't mention the text. See if you can do that consistently in response to different questions. And if you find that you can't do it and you're often just saying the same thing and it doesn't even relate to the question, or you're repeating the question, then just go straight into introducing the texts. So it's a little bit dependent. Hopefully that helps. Are we posting prompts we want answered here? I've got some good ones. You can post questions here. Always with these live streams, I see how many questions come through. It's a little bit of, like kind of seeing how we go. I've always got responses in the background that I can go through. I can always break down some essays for you. But what's more important often is for everyone who's made the time to join the live stream, I want to answer your questions. So let's get through those this session. Let's see how we go. If we have time to get through the responses, I will. Otherwise, I'll get to that in the next one. How do you add quotes for broad macro features? Like if I want to talk about alternating comedic and political scenes in King Henry IV Part 1 structure for Mod B, how do you add quotes for broad macro features? All right. If you're talking, okay, this is a really good question. Really, really good question. So, first of all, quotes can be used in different ways. So if you don't have to have a quote that proves something about the structure. You can talk about the structure and embed a quote that fits in with your analysis of why that structure was used. But the quote itself does not always have to prove the macro feature. The macro feature often has a little bit more flexibility in that respect. But that's why you need to understand that quotes, while they should always they should almost always prove the technique, especially when it's a specific technique. Like if you say there's a metaphor or personification, sure, capture that in the quote. But the best students use quotes in another way, which is really handy for the macro features. So for broad things like the narration style, structure, genre, they will actually use quotes to kind of embed that textual analysis in their sentence, but it doesn't necessarily kind of contain a direct example of comedy or of a political scene, right? It's probably from one of those scenes if you're looking at scenes in this case, but it just needs to kind of flow in to your sentence of analysis and show that engagement while you're explaining the broader effect of that feature, if that makes sense. Now, sometimes you'll get a broad feature like first person narration. Let's say if there's first person narration, then obviously try and get a quote that says I or my, because if you have a quote that says I or my, then it is proving first person. But I wouldn't just pick out a quote because it says I or my. I would pick out a quote because it says something else that's important. So maybe it contains a specific technique within that quote. So I felt like I was this, and then maybe there's a simile in there. So it's like you're proving the first person narration, but you've also got a specific technique in the quote as well. So that's another way you can think about using quotes. You could have a quote that does kind of back up the macro feature if it applies, but it also should be a meaningful quote that contains ideally another specific technique that you can incorporate. So I'm giving you a couple of ideas here of what to do depending on what it is. Sometimes, unlike first-person narration, which is easy to prove with I or my, you get something like, okay, there's alternating comedic and political scenes, or, it goes from this kind of these serious elements to these very comedic elements. So there's this hybridity there, right? There's there's kind of these unusual or unorthodox comedic elements that are interwoven into this play. Now, hopefully you could find a quote that is an example of the comedic genre. That would be my advice here for you, okay? So if you wanted to talk about a comedic scene, then can you find a short quote that has something comedic? Now, what could be comedic? Wit, anything witty, like a witty line that Falstaff says. Someone or maybe Falstaff isn't saying, maybe he's saying a silly line, right? Maybe it's something farcical or sarcastic, facetious. Find a short quote that could back up a comedic element, and then find something more serious in a political scene, and you just use those quotes as examples of those alternating scenes, because they are just examples of the broader element. So yeah, there are kind of a few ways to do it. I feel like, let me see if I can share something with you now. And if you have a specific like quote or example that you're looking at, paste it in the chat right now. And why don't I just give you the live example there? So sticking with Alex here for a second. Bear with me. I can see how there are a few other questions there. Alex, you're still with us? Alex, if you are with us, put some more context in there for this question. We can literally share a screen now and go through this. Okay, so alternating comedic and political scenes. If we're talking about the structure. Okay, look, let me just give you a general example. I don't have any quotes off the top, but if you have quotes, put them in the chat and I'll come back to it. But let's see how we go here. Now I've got to put myself in the right spot here. It's a shame if we lost Alex. Alex got the question answered, but you've left us. Let me know if you're still here, Alex. Either way, I'm going to answer this. I think it's going to help everyone. So the question was about how do you provide a quote for a macro feature like comedic elements or an alternating structure. Okay, how do you provide a quote for a macro feature, not a specific feature? Everyone knows it's easy to get a quote for a simile. You just literally find the bit that has like or as, and you integrate that into the sentence, right? That is what we call a micro feature, a micro technique, or a specific technique. Micro, macro, right? So it's important to understand that, of course, that would be a more direct use of a quote, right? But when you're dealing with something like a comedic element or an alternating structure, what we'll try and do, a macro feature, something to do with the form, the genre, and the style. And by the way, all of you should incorporate lots of this. You should talk about things like the structure. Is it a 5-act structure? You should talk about the genre. Is it the comedic? Is it a history? Is it a tragedy, right? What is it? If you're studying a novel, is it a dystopian novel, dystopian fiction? Whatever it is, you should be talking about these things, but don't feel like you can't incorporate quotes to back them up, right? Narration style. You should always talk about narration style or perspective if you can. If it's a play, it's a little bit different, but certainly you could talk about stage directions. You could talk about the dialogue, okay, and those kind of things. You know, monologue, dialogue, monologue, soliloquies. Soliloquy. Okay, so these are examples of macro features. The question is, how do we use a quote? Let me show you a couple of ways. So first of all, if you are using a macro feature like narration, sometimes it is as easy as getting a quote that has the word I in it, or get a quote that has my in it, you know, and that's going to help prove the first person. That proves it's first person narration. But don't just pick any quote with I or my, because there's going to be thousands. Okay, what you do is you choose a quote that also has a specific technique. So you can actually say something like, facilitated by the first person narration style, the narrators or the protagonists personification, or let's say, like, I'm going to use the most basic example here, guys, but like people say avoid similes, etc. Similes are fine, but wouldn't use it more than once in an essay. The protagonist simile to describe my, now I'm using my, and I'm trying to like incorporate or embed this in a very seamless way, so you don't have to pause before saying the quote. Just making this up, by the way. The protagonist simile, see, you've got simile, but you've also got first person narration style to describe my life as a fairy tale. My life is a fairy tale, right? Well, it says as, that's why it's a simile. But notice here, this is a really great lesson for you. If you want to use a macro element, you can fuse it together with a micro element. Look at the green and the orange here. And then you can actually go on to work both together in your analysis, right? Reveals, right? So that's one way of dealing with a macro feature, and that's to bring in a micro feature, right? So this strategy here is to pair it with a micro technique. That's if you can find a quote that has I or my. In this case, about the structure or the genre, it was talking about alternating scenes, right? What you can do is you could just get, for alternating scenes, you juxtapose, find examples that relate to the genre. So if you're talking about comedy, think about what is a specific technique that is comedic. Find a witty or a sarcastic remark by one of the characters. And you just work that in, right? And then you would say the play's alternating structure between the witty remarks of Falstaff, I'm just giving an example, between the witty remarks of Falstaff, who, critiques the absurd or something, like literally put something witty that he says there, who critiques the something, and the alternating structure between the witty remarks of that and the politically charged something of like a quote politically charged debate about something serious there. See how we're getting the quotes in there to support examples of each type, right? So that's how you can get that in. And then you could say demonstrates the fusion of comedy and politics or history to create, a compelling drama or represent a compelling dramatic representation of performance. Like literally, I'm saying nothing by saying that, but I have no specific quotes here. But like that's the kind of structure that you can go with there, where you are pulling in quotes that are exemplifying each of these. Let me just break this up a little bit more so it's clearer. Okay, so that's the second way you can do it. And the third way you can actually get quotes in is to embed the quotes. Embed short quotes in your analysis to support, in your analysis of the form. So it doesn't even need to prove the form or be an example of the form, but you embed other quotes that relate to what you're saying about it. Okay, so if you have, something about the 5-act structure, the use of the 5-act structure. See, structure is an element of form. A lot of people don't talk about structure in their essays, but actually they would be wise to do so. Okay, the use of the 5-act structure allows Shakespeare to, track or trace the progression from Hotspur's, or let's say Hal's, if we want to talk about Hal, from Hal's initial status as a madman to, or into, let's say, transformation. From a madman into a something else, and see how those two quotes, we'd use two short quotes, and we're tying it in to make a point about the character's transformation, but we're actually talking about the 5-act structure. There is no specific quote about the 5-act structure, but the quotes are relating to the structure and how it progresses. So hopefully that makes sense. That's how, I think that was what you kind of wanted as your specific example. But I think you could use either of these two, where you do have an actual comedic example, or you just use shorter embedded quotes to say something that relates to the use of form, but it doesn't need to prove the form. You don't need to have a quote that literally proves there are 5 acts. So I hope that makes sense. Alex, yeah, does that make sense? I can see you're back active, so good to see you back on here. Our essay question was about textual integrity. Yeah, textual integrity. How does the form reinforce the meaning? Why do we still study it? It's all of those kind of things. Like what keeps that text tight, and how does the way it's written reinforce what it's saying, and how does what it's saying say something meaningful that's worth us studying still, right? Like how does it have that? How does it all fit together? It's one of those vague terms. I don't like the term textual integrity, but anyway, how the textual integrity enhance the textual integrity, if that helps. How the textual integrity enhance the text's textual integrity. I'm assuming that's a typo. I was trying to use the adjacent scenes to talk about how it forces us to compare. Yeah, you can definitely talk about that, but hopefully what I just explained does help clarify that. On that note, are one-word quotes fine? Yes, one-word quotes are amazing. If they're a meaningful one-word quote, use heaps of them. I'll tell you what the best students do. Some of them would use like 5 or 6 short one-word or two-word quotes in a sentence. They don't just have techniques. They're embedding them into the sentence as if it's their own words. Okay? That is going to impress the marker like you wouldn't believe, because it's showing such a good engagement with the text and such flair with how you're writing. So see the example on the screen now with Hal's transformation from a madman into, let's just say the later quote was a hero or a prince, demonstrates that those short quotes are so powerful because they're way easier to adapt and seamlessly flow into the sentence. The shorter the quote, the easier it is to work in, and it's basically just replacing what you would have said. But they're the easiest ones to use, but they're also the most impressive, and it means that the quote isn't taking up valuable time where you could be analyzing the text. You want most of the words to be your analysis, not the quotes and the examples. So that's why you should be focusing on short quotes, lots of them, replacing what you would have said yourself, in addition to proving specific techniques. Don't just use quotes to show a technique being used. Use a quote to show additional engagement with the text and to replace what you would have otherwise said about the meaning of the text or the meaning of that example. So I hope that makes sense. Embed quotes wherever you can. No, so you definitely are allowed to do it, and it's not spoken about that much, but the best students all do this. The best students, say you got 20 out of 20 in an essay, it'd be very hard to see a 20 out of 20 essay that didn't use quotes in this way. They wouldn't just have one quote and then this reveals this. It would say, here's the quote, this reveals this, and within their explanation, they'd have a couple of more little words that are quotes from the text. That's what you'll see in the top one. So I'm very glad you brought that up. You should be trying to actually go a little bit over the top. I want you all to go over the top with how many short quotes you're embedding into each sentence of analysis, in addition to the short quote that would prove the technique, if there's a specific technique that you are pointing out. But remember, don't just use specific techniques. Make sure, because the best students do this, they use macro features. You're talking about the form, genre, style, the narration, which is the voice, the perspective, okay, the structure. The best students use both of these together. I always say you've got to use the big techniques and the small techniques. Biggie smalls, right? That's how you remember it. All right. I think we've gone through those. I'm going to just see if there's any other questions here. Appreciate the support, guys. Appreciate the love in the comments here. You know, yes, you're saying you've watched a lot of the videos. Much appreciated. Hope they are helping. In terms of what you need to know, let me just remove this. In terms of what you need to know for Module C, yes, one prescribed text is generally all you need to know well for Module C as an inspiration. There's never been a question that says draw upon 2 prescribed texts. Your teachers are required to teach you at least 2 prescribed texts, and often they'll show you more than that as examples. But you need to know one really well and know the stylistic elements. You mainly need to know a couple of the core techniques that are used in the prescribed text so that you can then consciously use those in your own work or play around with those. And you need to then reflect on how you've used approximately two, I would say at least two techniques from that author's text. So focus on one prescribed text, focus on two stylistic devices, and they'll be the things that you're trying to use throughout, and they'll be the things that you talk about in the reflection, in one body paragraph in your reflection for each technique or stylistic element. Simple as that for Module C. What are my predictions for the Module C HSC question this year? Yeah, 2024 was a discursive. I mean, I don't want to say it. I don't know if I have the video proof of it. So then everyone will be like, oh, you didn't say it. I might not have made a video about it. I don't like to release prediction videos because then what if it doesn't happen that way? But I did bet on a discursive / persuasive. I was thinking, I think they're going to come up with an option to do a discursive or persuasive. That's what I was telling, all the students that I had worked with throughout the year. But easy to say that now. It's not something I put on record. Maybe this year, what I'll do is I'll make a video of my prediction and release it after the exam, just to see how it compares, right? And we do a comparison. I can tell you things to focus on to kind of cover all possibilities, which I think is always a sensible thing. Again, I wouldn't just say just focus on one. I focus on one that you're comfortable with, so a discursive and imaginative or persuasive, and then make sure that you know how to actually adapt that version or essentially rewrite it in a way, but preserve what you can of the original for the other two forms. So if you do a discursive, how could you write an imaginative piece that's about a similar idea? It is going to sound a bit different though. How could you adapt the discursive into a persuasive? That might not be that different. It's just the tone and how definitive you are and the framing of it that's different, but you could actually preserve a lot of the discursive material. So discursive is always a great one if you're comfortable with that, but start with the one that you like the most and then work from that. You have to be prepared for the three scenarios, unfortunately. I can't say it's going to be this year. Is it going to be exactly the same as last year? Probably not. Could it just ask for a discursive? Yep. Last year, with persuasive, would they just give a persuasive? It's unlikely, right? Imaginative and discursive, I'll say this, in my opinion, are the most likely ones that would be asked individually. But I just think too many students are disadvantaged by that because so many students do just rely on the imaginative or the discursive. And I think, they often give you an option of at least two. If they were to single out a persuasive, that would be brutal. I think it would catch a lot of people off. But there's only two more HSC exams before that syllabus switches over. Still going to be like effectively a Module C element, but I would be looking at the last couple of years trends in the questions, but I would also be prepared for all three anyway. There's no way I would go into it banking on one. Let's have a look here. I know most subjects have specific writing styles. What's the best recommended format for English? As I'm doing both extension and advanced, would the structures be different? The structures might be a bit different between extension and advanced English, that is, in the sense that extension will have a little bit more depth and detail at the beginning of an essay. So I'll just give you basically in terms of how you frame the analysis and whatnot, if they're going to be similar, you're just required to offer more depth in terms of the concepts, the ideas that you're exploring. But structurally speaking, the main difference, at least in terms of how I would approach, say, an essay for extension English, would be my introduction would be a little bit more split up. Like I would spend a little bit more time unpacking the concept, and this ties into what I was just saying with the conceptual focus. Like I would have an introductory paragraph, a little bit shorter, 3 or 4 sentences, that just unpacks a concept that's relevant. I wouldn't bring in any text yet. I would not bring in any text in the first intro paragraph. I would have a second intro paragraph that introduces all of the text that I'm going to talk about. But I've started with a conceptual introduction followed by a text introduction. And that's the difference structurally. You wouldn't need to do that with an advanced essay, but I would split up my intro into 2 parts so that you can get more depth, more nuance out of the concept, really show that you understand the ideas, and then bring in your text to introduce how they're going to support the argument and the concepts that you've just laid out. So more depth there results in a split intro. Otherwise, there's many ways to then go about your body paragraphs, but generally speaking, they're going to be pretty similar. I would always try to lead with a conceptual topic sentence instead of introducing the text straight away and then bring in the text in the next sentence. But you don't have to do it that way. I remember when I did it, a lot of my first sentences mentioned the text, but often I would have a concept and then bring in the text in the second sentence of each body paragraph. So that would be my advice structurally. That's the main point. I think if there's one takeaway, I would focus on that. Hi, Nala, by the way, a few of you joining. I'm just getting through some of these other comments. I'm just reading some interesting question here. Yes, a lot of questions. Great to see all of these come through. For the common module, do you need 3 human experiences or is 2 sufficient? I have a more detailed essay with 2 experiences, but I've heard HSE markers look for 3. Very interesting question. I would never think about it this way. Number of human experiences. My bet is that if I was to read through your essay, I could probably mention or find 7 or 8 types of human experiences that you've referred to. So I'm going to interpret that question as you saying, do I need 3 paragraphs or 2? I have more detailed essay with 2 experiences on the crucible. Yeah, I'm assuming you're saying experience is almost like a topic sentence or a body paragraph, because I don't think about it that way, to be clear. There are many human experiences. Human experiences is the most vague term, right? So let's be precise here. Do you mean, do I need 3 or 2 body paragraphs with 3 different concepts that you're calling human experiences? And I would aim for 3, okay? 3 is always strong. But I don't think about it like this, where it's like 1 experience equals 1 paragraph. You can think about it like that if you want, but I bet that there's tons of experiences that you're going to talk about in every paragraph. They're not all going to be exactly the same. So human experiences is the general module name. Try not to get too caught up with that language. Let's focus more on 3 paragraphs, 3 kind of stages, if you like, of the text, and you can then explore a different human experience in relation to each one, if that's how you're thinking about it. I always start with the problem. What's the initial problem or conflict or tension that is established in relation to a human experience or maybe a human behavior or human motivation? It all relates to human experiences. That's why I don't reference that when I think about this. I just think, what is a problem or a conflict that's established at the beginning of the text? And I'm sure you will be able to relate that problem to a human behavior, to a human motivation, to a human emotion, to a human quality, to a collective or an individual experience. You can work in those words as much as you like, right? But make sure you've got a very clear, specific concept that you're exploring, and you're not just saying this is the human experience of alienation. You actually have to tell us something about alienation. You have to tell us what the whole experience is. Why are people alienated? People are alienated when they go against or defy the status quo. Why? Because that threatens people's sense of ideological certainty. Like maybe, oh, you're threatening my values, and that's I don't like that. That's uncomfortable. You're out of the tribe. You're out of the group. You need to give us some depth in your explanation there. And of course, that is a human experience, but you're going to talk about tons of human experiences in your essay. It's not going to be like 2 or 3. I just try to avoid that language. 3 concepts, 3 key concepts, 3 body paragraphs, 3 topic sentences, lots of rubric language in terms of human behavior, emotions, etc. So I hope that makes sense. Quick question here. Would I lose marks for not having a conclusion for my Module A essay? Yes. Maybe it would only be 1 mark or 2. Probably at most 2 you would lose. If everything else was perfect, you could probably still get an 18, maybe 19. Always try to have at least a 1-sentence conclusion that kind of restates the thesis in relation to the question. But the way you can differentiate it from the thesis or the introduction is, what is the responder left to consider? What are we ultimately walking away with? What does the reader now take away given everything you've proven in your essay? So responders are invited to do this, right? They are left to ponder this. Okay, so leave us with something maybe provocative, or something that is conclusive, but not just fully conclusive. You're not just closing it. You're saying, look, here's what I've proven. Here's what we're meant to walk away with and think about. Okay, so if you can kind of frame a one-sentence conclusion that way, I ideally go for 2 sentences. And if you time your draft in advance of the exam and you cut down your essay to make sure you can do it in 32 minutes for a 40-minute exam, then you're not going to have to worry about this most likely. But you at the very least want to get a one-sentence conclusion to have that structural clarity and finality and tick that box essentially to have that conclusion so that you can get 20 out of 20. Even if you have to have no link sentence in the last body paragraph, or you have to cut your analysis by 1 sentence in the previous paragraph, I would do that so that I could get the 1-sentence conclusion in there so that I at least have that sense of structural completion. So yes, you would get marked down by 1 or 2 marks. Just have that 1 sentence that you would always be able to put in when there's 1 minute left on the clock. But ideally, I would prepare for a 2-sentence conclusion, and you can make them a bit shorter. Okay, so what else have we got here? One more quote. So Rahan, appreciate you subscribing to the resources. Just looking through that, I can see you kind of got 2. You checked out the Jeddle resources. You need more specific examples, or you need more specific context for an example, but you don't want to be storytelling. Go and have a look at the annotations on the Jeddle resources. Let me know in the comments if you had a look at the annotations, the tables, and you went through all of that analysis, because that will show you templated examples of how to take a quote and analyze it, giving it context, but also not storytelling. So I think you're going to find tons of examples there. Let me know if you've seen those sections, textual annotations. That's where you get all the body paragraph examples, in addition to the exemplars at the end. So to avoid storytelling as well, for anyone who feels like they sometimes are just storytelling, try and lead with the technique in the sentence, like the metaphor. Start with that framework, and then you can be a little bit more flexible after. But start the sentence with the technique that you're really interested in looking at. Tell us what it means, and then incorporate some of the plot and the context after it. Then you can be more flexible after that. But yeah, to avoid storytelling, lead with the technique at the start of the sentence, the metaphor. Through the metaphor, the composer does this. And then what you'll find that you might be able to do is bring in a little bit more context at the beginning of the sentence, right? Saying, as this happens in the text, comma, the metaphor does this. So you can often bring in a clause at the beginning of the sentence to establish some context. But because you then have a comma and then say the technique does this, it's not storytelling for the sentence. So I hope that helps. Lead with the technique at first. Consider bringing in an extra clause at the beginning with a comma, then get into the strict analysis. All right, I think I went through most of it. Another question coming through here at the end from, now I don't even know how to say it. Sorry if I'm saying it wrong, Isla or Isla. Sometimes it's a silent S there. How would you answer the following? Atwood's appropriation of the Tempest tag seed continues the conversation about how life is a performance. Yeah, this idea of life being a performance, that's a great question if you got that for Module A. Discuss focus on the performative nature of life, because performance really is at the heart. It's like kind of the motif between the texts. How would I answer it? I would be talking about how performance relates to different stages of the narrative in both texts. So how performance relates to revenge, because they treat it differently, right? Performance is, if we think about it on the problem side, so the beginning of your essay, always think problem, solution, problem, resolution, or like complication, resolution, problem, solution. If we think about the first part of the essay for this, and you can explore it in both texts, you can think about how performance relates to the revenge plot or the revenge element of each one. Revenge is less important in Hagseed. Performance is actually an escape. So you have performance, and the performance of Prospero and Felix, it's kind of an escape from their one, responsibility as Duke in Prospero's case, and two, the performance of the Tempest for Felix is an escape from the grief, right, of that he is suffering due to the loss of his daughter Miranda. So I would look at performance and the way it is used in relation to the concept of escape in the first part, and also you can tie in revenge there. Although revenge might come better in the next part. I would then talk about how performance and the fact that Prospero is a figurative director on the island when he's conducting his revenge, how performance is a catalyst towards liberation and forgiveness, because then we're moving towards the solution part. So if we think about Prospero conducting this metaphorical performance on the island when he's controlling all of the characters like a director through his magic, that ultimately leads him to an epiphany, to a realization that he has to actually let go of that control. So performance can catalyze these revelations that ultimately free us. They allow us to forgive others in the case of the Tempest with Prospero and relinquish control. And the performance of the Tempest itself within Hagseed is actually what allows Felix to forgive himself and let go of the grief, the sorrow, the regret that is associated with the loss of Miranda. Of course, he used the performance as a vehicle for revenge, but as Felix says, it was a secondary motivation. It wasn't his core, because the motivation changes because of the contextual shift. Felix doesn't care as much about using the performance of the Tempest in the prison to get revenge. What he really cares about is resurrecting his daughter through the performance, but it's through the process of teaching the inmates about the meaning of the play that he actually undergoes his own transformation and is able to let go. But performance is proven in both cases to be this cathartic medium through which characters can emotionally evolve and mature and actually relinquish control either of their magic as a metaphorical director or relinquish control of the past or of things that they have lost, like Miranda in Felix's case. So I hope that helps. That's how I kind of structure it. Problem, solution, performance insofar as it relates to a mode of escape. And then in terms of the second half of the essay, talking about how performance is a catalyst for catharsis, is a catalyst for transformation and liberation, that by conducting the play or by carrying out a performance, playing a role, that can actually lead you to certain discoveries about oneself and others and allow you to forgive and allow you to let go and allow you to transform and evolve. So I hope that helps as a framework there for that question. That's how I would think about splitting it up, and you can grab evidence to support each of those aspects. That's basically in order, by the way, of each narrative. So you can look at the first half, the beginning, and then you can look more towards the end for the catharsis element. And Rahan, last point here on the Jeddle resources, unsure whether copy-paste and the essay were relevant. Yeah, not copy-paste, but use it as inspiration for the framing. Have a look at how the analysis within the Jeddle resources and the annotations is framed. That is a way to avoid storytelling. So you can draw from it. You can use examples, obviously make it your own, tie it into your argument, but use it as examples. When you're doing an oral presentation, like a speech, it is effectively a spoken essay, but you need to use some rhetorical devices, right? Some rhetorical devices like a rhetorical question, like use direct second person as well. So use you. Have you ever experienced this? Appeal to the audience's emotions, right? Use pathos, ethos, logos. But for the most part, an oral presentation is usually a spoken essay. So build the essay first, then change the tone and style so it's more speech-like. And that could be through some repetition, through rhetorical questions, and through engaging directly with the audience. You, we, our, use those kind of pronouns. Excuse me. Any exemplars of that? Yeah, the best examples of an oral presentation are just really great essays that have been built first and then adapted through the style and tone to become more appealing to the audience that you are meant to be speaking to. In terms of any good topics that I could do, I mean, what do you mean topics that you could do? Doesn't the presentation have to be specifically on something? So let me know if you've got a bit more context around that. Like what is the point of this oral presentation? What unit of study is it? That's what I have to know to give you some topics, because I feel like we're going to be somewhat limited in terms of the topic, depending on what unit of study this is, unless you're just doing a general speech, but usually links to a particular unit. So let me know if you're still on the live stream, Rahan. Otherwise, we are going to wrap up shortly. Thanks for everyone who has stuck around for the live stream. It's been great to do some Q&A here. We will post some clips, some things that hopefully others will find useful. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Check out Jeddle.com for resources, and JeddAI, the marking tool for essay drafts and the like. So Jeddle.com is where to go for that. Rahan, just to finish up on this point, it's VCE, you get to choose an Australian topic. Yes, okay, I understand. So you're picking a topic. Obviously, if it's a persuasive, right, that you're building here, you're choosing an Australian topic. I mean, you can choose something about, if we can think about politically, socially, some of the contemporary issues. So, Australia as a republic, should we be a republic, or should we remain governed by England, effectively have the Queen and King, right? So there's always that debate, right? You can talk about, if we're thinking about social issues, you'd have to think about things that are relevant to you, relevant to what's going on. I always think, like, within Australia, bringing in technological topics is always good. Like how is technology affecting our ability to socialize, or maybe you can get more nuanced with it. But I think really looking at that contemporary issue of AI and your experience as a school student, without going into kind of the cliche school pieces that teachers get sick of seeing, if you can just talk about how social dynamics and relationships are changing through technology, and how people's identities are kind of becoming morphed because they're kind of so caught up in the digital world, but there's also still the physical world. That's a good kind of thing. Again, it's not so much a specifically Australian topic though. So I think, that political status one is one. You can obviously talk culturally, historically about our relationship with Aboriginals. It depends where they want you to go with that. But, First Nation peoples, like actually having that discussion about where we're at with that. Maybe you draw upon, The Voice and what happened there. Maybe you say that, the way we went about it was wrong. Like, we didn't give ourselves the best chance to get that through. Any social issue that is kind of important to you, I think, because then you'll have a bit more passion for it. We have to present it. So any funny or cool ways to be different. Oh, yeah. Okay. So I see. So in terms of actually presenting it stylistically, I always like, an anecdote. An anecdote is compelling. Not a lot of people will be game enough to do it, but actually giving a true story, or, you can, of course, fabricate it, but giving a story that's going to be a little bit funny, that's a bit self-deprecating at the start. So a self-deprecating anecdote at the start about yourself, and you can even fabricate it a little bit. It doesn't have to be exactly true. No one is going to verify every single fact, but it could be about someone else. But I think having a self-deprecating thing, that's going to be funny, and that makes people like you. And that's just a general thing. If you make fun of yourself, people will relate to that, right? Because they don't feel threatened by you. They feel like you're being vulnerable, so they trust you. They're open to you. So start with a self-deprecating, i.e. you making fun of yourself, story, maybe a time you messed up, a time you were embarrassed, an embarrassing story that relates to the topic that you're going to discuss. That is going to hook the audience. It's going to make them like you more, right, for lack of a better term. And they might already love you, I'm sure they do, as a person, but I mean in terms of the speech, it's going to make them connect with you as the speaker. So a self-deprecating / funny, embarrassing, concise anecdote or story about you that connects to the topic is a great way to introduce the topic. And I think that's going to help you stand out for sure. Something vulnerable, and also, in terms of presentation style, long pauses to create a bit of drama, right? Get people thinking. A lot of people speak so fast through the speech that we can't really process or get absorbed in it. But if you say something quite strong and provocative, like a short sentence that really hammers something home, pause for a few seconds, give people the tingles. So get them thinking, like, this happened to me. This could happen to you. Next bit. See that? Few seconds on the pause. This could happen to you. If you said something, at the start, say something kind of short and sharp, and then pause. And that's going to really sink in, right? Don't be afraid to put yourself out there that way. A lot of people don't do it because they feel like it's more comfortable to just kind of like murmur their way through it. But be confident in yourself. Pull your shoulders back when you're talking and be a little bit dramatic. Have the big pause. Hammer the point in and then stop and look at everyone. Maybe that's going to be funny to them, right? Maybe it's to do with a funny thing. Make fun of yourself at the start and have a big pause where you kind of make the joke about yourself and you're kind of like there's a facial expression, like, I didn't know what to do. And then you pause, right? But that could have been you. And then like you go into the topic, right? So use your facial expressions, use your body language, but be confident and project. If you're going to say something a little bit funny, don't go too overboard with the humor, by the way. I think just a self-deprecating thing that is people can laugh at because it's a bit embarrassing is good. But you also want to make a really good and persuasive argument. So don't be all about the jokes, okay? Reserve the jokes, focus more on that anecdote for the humor. And then long pauses after short, sharp, impactful points, or an impactful, or kind of a very high intensity sentence that kind of sums up what you're trying to say, or you're trying to get their attention. Rhetorical question. Any good speeches I could find inspiration from that I've seen online? Yeah, so let me have a quick think in terms of fitting into this assessment format. Examples that would have this. I'll have a think about it, Rahan. You mentioned you subscribed anyway, so I should have your email. Shoot me an email. Guys, if you have any questions, I'll put this on here. Feel free to reach out. I'll get back when I can. But that's the email there. Shoot through your question, Rahan, and I will shoot through some examples of speeches that I think could be relevant to you. But otherwise, I see how many quotes is too much in a quote table. Well, depends what the table's for, right? If the table is for one paragraph, then I think 4 is enough. Good to have 4 quotes for each text per paragraph. But if you're combining them, then it's going to be a little bit less. So hard to answer that without more context on it. I'd basically try and collect 12 quotes from each text that kind of cover enough ground thematically throughout the whole text. And then you can look at keeping, the top 6 or more throughout the essay from each, because in total, you're probably going to have about 12 quotes between both texts. But again, you're going to have lots of little quotes. So in those quote tables, you can have extra ones that just have really good short, sharp quotes that you can embed in addition to your core 12. So create core 12 quotes for each one. You'll probably end up narrowing it down to 6 when you do the comparative. And then you should have lots of little supplementary quotes that you can embed into the sentence in addition to the quote that you're using to prove a technique or a specific point. Hope that makes sense. All right, guys, thank you so much for tuning in. Great to see everyone. Great to see so many questions, to be honest, but I hope everyone has a great last week if you're in New South Wales. If you're in Victoria, hope you're enjoying your first week of the Easter break. A happy Easter to you all. I will see you before Easter. I'll see you next week. Tune in on Tuesday. If you've got more questions, assessment questions you want me to have a look at, please tune in. We'll be on around 7:30 next Tuesday. Otherwise, Jeddle.com for more content. Subscribe to the channel for me. Spread the word if you can. I would really appreciate that. But most of all, just thank you so much for being on here, and good luck with all of your studies. See you soon.